When you ask someone what their favorite arc in One Piece is, there are a few common choices. Alabasta, Enies Lobby, Marineford are pretty common answers, which makes sense. Each of these arcs represent One Piece at its best and have been out long enough for people to really digest it and appreciate its strengths and weaknesses, and compare them to other arcs. What do I mean when I say One Piece at its best? Well, in my opinion, it is when it uses a compelling character-driven story to get the audience engaged in larger conflicts and politics. To better understand what I mean by this, I like to group the arcs of One Piece into two categories. These two groups being the more character-driven arcs and the war arcs, where the large-scale conflicts take place. Water 7 and Sabaody Archipelago are good examples that I would consider more character-driven arcs. These arcs don't usually have any major antagonists for the main characters to fight against, and instead spend their time building up the characters and world building. While arcs like Dressrosa and Wano would be on the other side, focusing mainly on the already developed characters fighting against a major power in the world due to their connections made in the previous character arcs. The change that is created in the story decides what side of the spectrum the arc leans towards. If characters are the focus and are different by the end, then it is a more character-driven arc. While if something like an entire nation or island is changed, then it leads more to the other side. Finally, this leaves the arcs I mentioned before in the middle, Alabasta, Enies Lobby, and Marineford. These arcs have the best of both worlds. Alabasta is a good example of this. It has the end goal of defeating Crocodile to prevent him from taking over the nation. But the reason the Straw Hats have any reason to be there is because of their connection to Vivi. So when the arc is over, it is a victory for the nation, but more importantly, the characters and for Vivi. That is One Piece at its best, using a compelling character-driven story to get the audience engaged in larger scale conflicts and politics. Compare that to an arc like Skypiea, which leans really far to the war side, because there is a lack of development from the characters and the focus is instead on the people of Skypiea and Enel, and the history of the island. Luffy and the others travel to the island and seem almost reluctant to really help the people there. Nami, Usopp, and Chopper just want to leave, Zoro and Sanji just go wherever the captain and the ladies go, while Robin and Luffy want to explore the island. Luffy even outright tells the old god that they don't want to help them fight Enel at first. While there are still some cool bits of world building and funny character interactions which makes me still enjoy the story arc, the only change caused by the end of the arc is the island being free, which is a change on the grander scale and not for the characters, so it leans to the right and away from the middle, where there is a more enjoyable balance there. For me personally, I prefer the arcs that lean more to the character side, so I really do appreciate One Piece for its ability to get me to care about larger struggles that affect groups of people on these islands by showing how they affect specific people that I grew to care about, which is why I even like arcs like the first few filler arcs and the Long Ring Long Land arc, or the Foxy arc, even though there isn't much change. Foxy isn't put in jail or stops being a pirate, he just goes his separate ways from Luffy, and the only character change we see is between Zoro and Sanji, and Luffy wearing an afro, which unfortunately hasn't returned yet in the story. I still just enjoy watching these characters interact with each other, and so I still enjoy the Foxy arc more compared to something like Wano. But I say all this to point some attention to the Whole Cake Island arc, the arc I believe to be the best in the story. This arc focuses on my favorite parts of One Piece that had been missing for a while. The majority of arcs after the time skip have been focusing less and less on the Straw Hats and more about the world at large, so Whole Cake Island was a nice breath of fresh air, since it focused mainly on Sanji and Luffy, who are my two favorite characters in One Piece. Because of this, it leans away from the arcs that focus more on larger politics and war, and more towards the character-focused side, which is my favorite. It also has some of the best emotional moments in the series, which is what had originally hooked me onto the series, and finally has the most interesting antagonist as well. I had made a video already about why I love Luffy, so go watch that if you want, but one of the reasons I like him is how straightforward and genuine he is. That aspect of his character is highlighted in this arc by how they contrast with Sanji. Sanji's struggle of wanting freedom and to live happily with his friends but being burdened with something out of his control is just very tragic. He got to experience firsthand how fun it is adventuring on the sea with his friends and tries to sacrifice himself so that they can keep cruising on without him. It's always been part of his character to act behind the scenes to make sure that everything is going smoothly, but in this arc he has to learn the lesson that it's okay to rely on others even when it puts them in a worse scenario alongside you. This arc is very relatable in that way. It can be tempting to bottle up your feelings and insecurities so that way you aren't a burden on anyone. They are your problems after all, so why bother anyone but yourself with them? But it is a very self-destructive way of thinking, and it is important to open up and rely on people that are close to you, even if it is hard to put yourself out like that. Even when Luffy, someone that has been nothing but the best and most supportive friend for Sanji, is reaching out for him and screaming for him to come back, Sanji still pushes him away. He genuinely believes that the Straw Hats and Luffy would be happier to live on without him than to struggle beside him. The fight that they have when they reconnect is one of the most brutal sequences in One Piece and is hard to watch every time. And I really like how Luffy tries to get Sanji to ask for help himself. It reminds me of how he had to wait to accept Usopp back into the crew. In order to fix the root of the problem in Sanji, he needs to ask for help of his own volition. He doesn't force Sanji to realize this fact, instead he sits and waits for Sanji to do it himself. The conflict and frustration that both of these characters feel is very understandable. They are both looking out for each other, with Sanji thinking it should be easy for Luffy to leave and not look back, and is frustrated when he doesn't, and Luffy trying to get Sanji to understand that he would rather give up everything he has and die if he can't achieve his dreams with his friend by his side. The speech Luffy gives is perfect, with great lines like, "No matter how many times you kick me, you're the one who gets hurt. If you don't come back, I'll be here starving to death. And finally, without you, I can't become the king of the pirates." Man, to see someone so headstrong and passionate, willing to give up everything that he has worked to achieve just for the sake of one of his friends is so powerful. This fight and Luffy's fight against Usopp are my two favorite fights in the show, and it's no surprise that they are the most character focused as well. These fights just feel like the hardest ones that Luffy had to go through. Even after this scene plays out between Sanji and Luffy, the situation gets even worse and complex, with Luffy struggling to fight Big Mom's army after fighting one of the Sleet generals and Sanji after, before being thrown in jail. We get to see more focus on the characters of Sanji and Luffy. We get to see Luffy once again willing to sacrifice himself for his friends by trying to rip his arms off for Sanji. And we get to see the heart-crushing scene where Sanji realizes just how hopeless his future is. The scene where Sanji overhears Pudding and Reiju is one of the most cruel scenes in all of One Piece. Before the reveal, Pudding was the last positive thing that Sanji had going for him. It was really heartwarming to see the hopeless romantic finally find a girl who was receptive to him and even showed interest back in him. We can see how Sanji had changed by seeing how he talks about Pudding compared to other women. Sanji isn't as lustful and horny as he is in the past with other women, but instead is more considerate towards her because he genuinely loves her and wants to be the best man he can be for her. It seems like even in these terrible circumstances, Sanji is still growing as a person and makes the best of his situation, which makes it hurt all the more when Sanji tries to give her a present full of the food that he is the most proud of, the favorite food of all of his friends. This is where we see him overhear how Pudding is truly disgusted by him. The heartbreak that Sanji feels here is something that I believe a lot of people can connect to. This scene combines the horrible feeling of overhearing something about yourself that you shouldn't have, and the feeling of knowing that the person you love, or your crush that you might have had, doesn't feel the same way about you. And knowing that this was Sanji's last escape from the terrible life he had lived, after he had just in his mind ran away from the Straw Hats and can't go back, is surrounded by his family that abuse him and are just using him for a relationship with Big Mom, and now was rejected by the last person that could have brought him happiness. That last bit of hope and relief Sanji once had being put out is tragically symbolized by him struggling to light his cigarette. Luckily for us though, this is where the show turns around. Luffy had escaped earlier thanks to Jinbei and is waiting for Sanji, who is running back to him just to reconnect with a single person who genuinely cares about him. He still hasn't changed his mind about sacrificing his happiness for his friends to continue without him, but just needs someone to be there for him in this moment. This interaction between Luffy and Sanji is unsurprisingly another beautiful and touching scene between the two of them. Luffy is true to his word and has been starving himself without Sanji and eats Sanji's food that anyone would consider to be wasted and inedible. Because it really doesn't matter to Luffy how good the food is, all that matters to Luffy is that it was made by Sanji. After this is when they continue their argument when they first met on the island, where we get to see Luffy break down Sanji till he finally confesses to what he really wants. I love these more tender and intimate moments between characters since they are a big reason why I and many others love the show in the first place. One Piece isn't best known for its cool fights, but rather the characters around those fights. It's the kind of shows where the characters walking towards a fight is more iconic and memorable than the fight itself. Many fans describe Arlong Park as the first story in One Piece to really hook them on the series, with the most prominent scene being when Nami asks Luffy for help. This emotional character-driven hook is the best in my opinion in Whole Cake Island between Luffy and Sanji, more so than even Nami and Luffy in Arlong Park, Robin and Luffy in Enies Lobby, and Usopp and Luffy in Water 7. This might be because, as I said before, that Sanji is my favorite character besides Luffy, so obviously I would enjoy it the most. But I feel like because we are so late and towards the end of the story, we would not expect such a complex falling out between two of the main characters in the story. But Sanji's willing attitude to sacrifice himself for the crew has been there since the East Blue, and his behind-the-scenes nature has been built up for the whole story. Many times in the story, we can see the Straw Hats show how willing they are to give up their lives for Luffy, but we always see them say this away from Luffy. Knowing Luffy, it makes a lot of sense that he would hate for this to happen. I mean, we've seen it already with the quick fight he had with Vivi, when he realized how she was willing to sacrifice herself without involving her friends. Luffy wants to face these conflicts head-on beside his friends, and in Whole Cake Island with Sanji as the focus, we get to see this clash of ideals. Even though the majority of the arc does focus on Sanji and Luffy, we still get to see some very cool scenes from many of the side characters. Jinbei and Brook are obvious examples of this, with Jinbei having the unbelievably badass moment when he leaves the Big Mom Pirates, getting Luffy out of prison, which was necessary for him to reconnect with Sanji, and to fight back against Big Mom in the final escape attempt. And Brook fights one-on-one against Big Mom, stole a copy of her poneglyphs, slept with her, and caused her to go psycho at the wedding. Even Chopper and Nami got cool moments to shine. I really enjoyed the limited crew that the Straw Hats had when going through this island. It made it seem that much more desperate, and every character really had to pull their weight in order for them to survive. The beginning of the arc focuses on further exploring the characters and the connections between them to lead up to the second half, when they are desperately trying to escape. It's simply One Piece at its best. The final part of this arc that I want to focus on is Luffy's fight with Katakuri, the best antagonist in the series so far. I love this fight for many reasons, but it all leads back to the more character-driven focus that the entire arc has been focusing on. Katakuri probably has one of the most developed backstories and fights right next to Doflamingo. This makes the fight way more engaging for me since it helps give the fights more direction instead of just falling into the trap that can be seen in other fights, where it becomes a repetitive back and forth between Luffy and the antagonist, where every attack that is exchanged doesn't have lasting consequences of the fight afterwards. These scenes really lessen the impact of the fight since they could have been taken out and nothing would change in the fight. With the fight with Katakuri, however, there are so many moments where we get to see the fight evolve and change because it focuses on Katakuri's character throughout it. Every time the story cuts away from the Straw Hats escaping, we get to see an important story beat between Katakuri and Luffy in addition to a cool fight. It starts off in a very straightforward way, with Katakuri wanting to quickly overpower Luffy, showing off the tough guy facade Katakuri puts on with his family. But as Katakuri recognizes how strong and defiant Luffy is, even when there is no logical way for him to win, he starts to respect him and is furious when his sister intervenes in the fight, even if it would help him. The characters can be seen flinching in pain from the injuries they received prior. Scenes like Katakuri stabbing himself out of respect for Luffy and killing his own subordinates makes the fight more engaging, not only because it makes him more threatening as an opponent, but instead because it gives us insight into who he is as a character. Even when the two do end up making simple attacks on each other, they hit the other person directly instead of just punching each other's fists and bouncing off of each other. This really goes a long way in making the fight seem more impactful and exhausting for both characters involved. The fight also shows the best growth from Luffy in the series as well, within a fight. Not only is the fight engaging, but it helps give us a better perspective of the world at large. Luffy is struggling this much against a person who is under a Yonko. I mean, by the end of the fight, Luffy doesn't even win because he overpowered Katakuri with strength, but instead because Katakuri just lost the motivation to keep fighting Luffy. This fight is just a step for Luffy, which means the fight isn't just awesome in a vacuum, but it makes the future fights of the series even more exciting to look forward to. That basically covers every important aspect that I feel I wanted to emphasize from this arc. I could go into every little aspect that I like about this arc, but I edit this video myself and I don't want to do that much work. But I will highlight some of them to further emphasize how well-rounded and focused the arc is. Sanji's interactions with his family is a very interesting, sad, and believable extended backstory that fits Sanji's character. Sanji's interactions with his mother, father, brother, and sister all serve to reinforce us on who Sanji is as a person by comparing and contrasting him against the good and bad influences in his family. His actions towards them and Pudding, even after all that had happened, show just how kind of a person Sanji is. He never really gets his revenge on them, but rather just leaves them to continue living their miserable lives. Pudding was one of the most shocking characters in this arc. She went from being someone that I was cautious of, to being a likable person and bride for Sanji, to being one of the most unlikable people in the show, to finally having a really touching moment when she realizes how awful she had been to Sanji. How family influences people is a theme that was handled really well in Whole Cake Island. The effects that the Big Mom family had on Pudding and Katakuri, and how the Germa family affected Sanji, all while using the setting of a wedding, was really well done. We got to see how the Straw Hats were able to really resonate with Pudding and Katakuri just by being themselves. This was also the arc where Big News Morgans was introduced. He is one of the cooler characters that I didn't even know I wanted until I saw him. It was cool to see the man behind the newspaper, and it was really cool to see how he considered Luffy the 5th Emperor of the Sea. The only complaint that I really have about the arc isn't really specific to it, but it was how underwhelming Sanji's raid suit ended up being in the grand scheme of things. To me, it seemed like the story was setting up a moment like what Robin had in Wano, that Sanji would embrace the darker aspects of his life in order to fight to support the crew. But he ended up using it casually when fighting a random dinosaur in Wano, which was weird to see considering how reluctant he was to keep it, and decided only to keep it for an emergency. It's not really a complaint for Whole Cake Island specifically, but it was still very weird.